We'll avoid any incidents. All right, let me know when. Are we unmuted?
Yes.
And we're recording.
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to our January 19th, 2023 Blue Space and Aquifer Committee meeting. First meeting of 2023. Happy New Year. We're going to go ahead and get started with introductions. I like to start in person in the room. My name is Kara Haley, current PBAC chair, work for City of Pullman. Let's go this way.
And Sean Coates, Pullman Public Works Director.
Eileen McCall, recently embattled city council member and still on PBAC.
Rusty Vineyard, Director of Facilities, University of Idaho.
Paul Kimmel, I work for Avista, but I represent Latah County on PBAC.
Lana Cohen, UI Water Resources. I'm filling in for Tim Lang.
Tyler Palmer, City of Moscow rep the PBAC and current PBAC vice chair.
Sandra Kelly, new to the PBAC meeting, Moscow City Council person.
Jeff Lanigan, WSU Facilities.
We will jump over to a couple guests here while we're.
Gene Elliott, community member.
Kyle Beckett with Alta Science Engineering.
Perfect.
Celia Ford, PBAC Executive Director. All right, so
That's important.
online, we start with Michael.
Michael Parker, City of Moscow.
Steve.
He unmuted, but we couldn't hear him.
Steve,
Interesting.
we can see you unmuting, but we can't hear you. We'll come back.
I'll bet you said something awesome though, Steve.
Michelle.
Maybe. Oh,
Also-
do we have our volume?
Uh-oh.
Also unmuted. But can't hear. Well, we heard
Oh, we
Michael.
did it. Yeah, you're right.
Kristen.
Kristen Reisenauer, City of Pullman.
Okay.
Right.
Colt.
Colt Shelton, JUB Engineers.
Chris.
Chris Beard, Washington Department of Ecology, Water Resources Program.
Let's jump to Michelle. We can see you.
Oh, hi, this is Michelle, Idaho Department of Water Resources in Coeur d'Alene.
Perfect. Let's go to Tom Lamar. We're doing introductions, Tom. I know you just joined us. Maybe.
Let's try not to trip on the way to the office.
Okay. Well, we know Tom is here. Let's mark him in, Latah County. Steve. Let's see if we can hear from you at all. We may want to hear.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Gonna give us a quick intro? Or I can. Technical advisor, Steve Robichon.
Steve Robichon, I work for PBAC, Technical Advisor.
Perfect. Did we miss anyone?
I think that's it.
Okay. And maybe we just lost Tom, but he'll be back.
I think he's walking to another building.
Oh, lost service or something. So, all right. Well, let's move on to approval of our last meeting's minutes, which was November 17th, 2022. Those were sent out in the packet that Saline provided.
I move approval of the November minutes.
Second.
Okay. Any discussion? All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. I have a public comment for items not on the agenda. We didn't get anything in advance. Not hearing anything over here or in online world. So we'll move past unfinished business and on to new business. And we've covered this a little bit, but we've got it here on our agenda. So we'll just recap on some new appointments. We have Lana filling in for Tim, at least for the next half a year or so.
June officially, yeah.
Okay, till June officially. Welcome. Glad you are joining us. And then,
Can we, Madam Chair, can we get a little bit more of an introduction from Lana?
yeah, that would be great.
You're well here. You.
Thank you.
Tell us your whole story.
Life story.
How's your relationship with your mom?
Yeah, we definitely don't have time. Know what I was signing up for here. No, I work as a research associate. on one of Tim's projects at PBAC. So that's how I'm in with them. I've been in the Moscow Pullman area for 5 years maybe. I worked at WSU for a year, and then switched over to UI. So yeah, my previous career is in atmospheric science. So that's the side of stuff I know now. I'm kind of switched into more hydrology, water resources stuff.
Awesome.
Welcome.
Thank you, Tyler. That was a good call. I'm just zipping through things, not thinking here. We also have Sandra, welcome, joining us with new appointments, and we get to keep Eileen. So welcome, everyone. Anything else? Appointments? Okay. We're going to move on to presentation and discussion. And the first one is from Kyle Duckett, and Steve Robichon, I'm sure, is going to chime in as well. We're going to get an update on the 2022 Datalogger downloads and some nice info in the packet as well.
I have a quick PowerPoint, but it's not 100% necessary if it's a pain.
I don't know where it was.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Where?
Oh, I think it's in here.
Is it over here?
In the cabinet.
If it's gonna be a
Oh, I actually think
It should be pretty easy.
probably do it.
give the folks online something to look at, maybe.
I don't know. I don't know either.
Is this a computer?
Yeah. Those sugar bones.
It actually may be they may have transferred with the TV, and it may actually be on the back here.
Yeah. It's not the end of the world either. I want to be realist here. Well, now it's a challenge.
Right.
Yeah, I was gonna say, there it is. All I'm talking about.
We're smart. We can figure this out. I have faith.
There it goes. I heard it. It's there.
Well, I'm eating a cookie, so. Thank you to Alta Science and Engineering for the cookies.
Yeah, we're going to insulin shock.
I know.
So this is a PBAC.
I can't imagine putting one of those down.
It's pretty brief.
Okay,
Um,
let me just make sure I'm hearing.
What's the
Yeah.
little arrows on?
make
the
sure
side?
everyone can see it.
All right.
Cool. So just a quick update of our loggers throughout 2022. It's all good news, so it makes my job easy. We've got 34 sites, visited them all, got representative data from all of them. Haven't heard anything, no SOSs from Steve, no questions that we couldn't answer. So everything good there. So let's just kind of scroll down here. And so no quarterly downloads. So Langman's project's over. So that made things a little bit, it brought the budget down this year. So kind of is what to expect moving into the future. No more quarterly downloads. Keep trucking here. So did the recommendations and replacements that we had spoke about and worked into the statement of work. Replaced all the loggers we wanted to. We've got one DOE site that we've still got a couple old spares in. We adjusted their logger this last year. We're kind of waiting to see, make sure that we're going to get good representative data from there. So we've got a few spares out there. Resuspended a couple wells to, more easily slide in and out of casings, but nothing out of the ordinary. Keep trucking. The deliverables, same as in the past. So summary memo telling you, everything I'm telling you now, and, probably a little more detail even than, probably even than you want. But short, succinct, concise, what happened, would help anybody in the future figure out why we're doing what we're doing. Status sheet. So as we're buying loggers, we're tracking them, keeping track of their age, and we can replace them accordingly and kind of keep up with what we're doing here. With that, the download binder, so that's, that we're not reinventing the wheel on that every year. We're just adding to it if necessary. So for example, we got, one of our private wells that we monitor, the Shumway well, got some new residents this year. So I got to meet them, and, they're on board and excited to help. So that's all tracked, contact info, what loggers are there, how do you download them, whether to bring bee spray. I meant to throw on here, I have a funny picture. There was a few horses that were giving me a hard time. The INEL sites, they were pretty friendly, but got my heart going for a second. And kind of as an aside, I'm gonna work with many of you may know Jerry. I'm spacing Jerry's last name.
Fairly.
Jerry Fairley at U of I, thank you. So I'm gonna work with Jerry and we're gonna put a lock on that well. So he'll have a key, we'll have a key. And the horses can't pull the cap off and mess with our loggers anymore. But I gave you these numbers last year and I realized I kind of oversimplified it. So I did 34 sites divided by a 10-year life expectancy, but it's actually a little more complicated than that. And don't try to read all that because it's a lot of text. But basically, there's 20 sites that we have data loggers at that are, solely us. And there's actually 10 sites that WDOE has loggers at that we don't, that we take use of. So another good opportunity to just give a shout out to them and to IDWR, for making those available to us and that collaboration. So with that updated number, so PBAC actually has 28 loggers out there. So go to that next slide, Saline. Thank you. So we're looking at like 2 to 3 data loggers per year. There's 7 sites that have some sort of overlap. So like IDWR has a logger and we have a logger. As those loggers, get to age, we could phase those out potentially. Having this collaborative agreement, something we, kind of continue to talk about. How do we save money? How do we have less loggers, but still get the same data or more data? And really what we're looking at, if we phase those out, it's like 2 to 3 loggers a year. And we're going to talk a little bit about potentially another logger at the Genesee well. And that is going to fit right into that. It's not going to affect our expected or anticipated budget much. Yeah.
On the wells where it's just IDWR or DOE, so we don't go collect data there, they just share their data with us?
We do, yeah.
Okay.
So I do visit those sites. That's a good question. And, if that's something that we can work out, I think those conversations are important. And, if we can get the same data without visiting, I'd be open to those discussions and however we can, streamline this with our collaborators. We're giving them data that they wouldn't otherwise get from a few of our sites. They're helping us with data as well.
And we do share that out
I do share,
traditionally
yeah.
with them.
So I share that with WDOE, any of the private well owners that want to see their data, I make that available for them.
Okay.
So yeah, just trying to be good data sharers.
Yeah, great.
So I think we're pretty much there. So moving forward, again, we're looking at like 2 to 3 per year. This next year, we do have 4 loggers that are phasing out. So I think, this year's a higher year. Next year, we're going to have actually fewer, like maybe none or just like 1 or 2 loggers to replace. So we kind of have finally caught up and now it should be just a few loggers a year going into the future. So as far as budget, our rates did go up a little bit. Alta's rates did go up a little bit this new year. But I don't think it's gonna impact our estimate in any real substantial way. Getting quicker every year, getting all the bugs worked out, everything that needs fixed in the field is getting fixed. So it's getting more streamlined. And some of you know, I know, but some of you may not know. I've relocated up near Kellogg, so I'm no longer in the Moscow area. But all that's going to mean is just a little more concerted effort. Downloads will probably happen over a shorter time span this next year instead of being stretched through the summer. So, but yeah, besides that, things can continue as normal. And again, we have a Genesee well that is ripe for a data logger. So kind of a additional discussion there. I don't know, where does that fit in on the agenda?
Well, we ask questions on this
next, but I think Steve might have some stuff. But if anyone have questions?
I don't think so. I don't.
Good.
I was
Thanks for your work.
It's all good news. Yeah. So
have you and Kyle or Robin talked about when I assume the sooner we get a proposal for this year's work, the better, and then that way you can plan accordingly, or do we have
Yeah, to start
thoughts on when
those
we might get them?
discussions in hopes that we can talk about that as well and maybe put it over together.
Right.
But yeah,
Okay.
we'll make sure we're on top of that a little quicker this year.
Cool. Maybe March or April or.
Mhm.
Do you have a map, of all 34 sites on it?
It's a big map, so it's low resolution at that scale, but what I have that's even better, if you're familiar with Google Earth.
Yeah, you can.
I'll show you the-
Where,
yeah.
gives you whatever it is.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll share interested
Yeah.
in that as
Can
well.
we share that with the group, the link?
If you can just send it to Celine, she can send it out.
So in the future, I'll just make that as one of the deliverables. It won't change or it shouldn't change. But if I add the Genesee well on there, I'll just include that with
Great.
the deliverable area. Yeah.
I can follow up after the meeting and get it to everyone.
Great.
I think there's a question.
Yes, Chris.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that all of the wells that we have loggers in are ideally uploaded to our public facing database. It's called EIM, Environmental Information Management. It doesn't happen super regularly, but just if anyone isn't aware that that's out there, it is available online. And if you don't see it, you can reach out to me or Patrick and see if it just needs to be uploaded or whatnot.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Do you know how frequently that is intended to happen?
Yeah, it should be yearly when we go do, because we try to get out to the Pullman wells yearly. And then once, yeah, so usually it takes just, I don't know, a month or so to get it uploaded. I think he usually sends it to our coordinator, but I just got permissions to upload to it as well. So that
Okay.
could be more streamlined. But like I said, if you have trouble finding anything, reach out to us, because it's not the best database. It was built for water quality, and kind of our monitoring data was kind of pigeonholed into it. We're trying to kind of fix that, but it's kind of hard to navigate. So
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep.
So I guess, yeah, we'll just stay in touch on that, Celine, and maybe I can, catch up with Chris and Patrick, catch up with Daniel at IDWR and figure out if there's any additional ways we could streamline for this year's scope, and then just, keep Steven on the conversation and make sure, we're gonna get everything that we need. But,
Got nice photos.
thanks.
You take those?
This one, the view,
Yeah.
yeah, that was on a field day.
Go ahead.
For members of the public that might be viewing this recording and myself, could you just do a really quick overview of the data? What type of data are you getting on these loggers?
Yeah, good question. So it's water
Quality,
elevation.
quantity, what is it?
Yeah, so it's water elevation data. So these loggers, I should have brought one, and sorry, Steve, I never ended up getting a chance to cut one in half. We were gonna cut one open so we could see the guts. This week has kind of been anyways. They're, look like a fancy, like a metal cigar is about the perfect way to put them. Like that's the size, the shape. They're a conical cigar shaped little, they're a Datalogger, equipped with what's called a pressure transducer on there. So you hang them down into the well, and based on the water level above the sensor, it can sense a certain amount of pressure. And using we track also the barometric pressure at the ground surface. So you can kind of use the atmospheric pressure, the barometric pressure. You can figure out, based on the pressure on that logger, how much water is above the logger, how deep is the water in the well. So we track the water levels across the Palouse and are able to, kind of discern different things based on the water level. So like long-term tracking, are the water levels declining over time? And then also for some sites, more seasonal or other interesting.
Very good, thank you.
And this data goes off to Steve Robichon, and he'll process and present it. So
Yeah, Steve, this may be a good segue for what you were gonna maybe present on.
Okay, thanks. Kyle covered some of the stuff I'm going to present on, and as usual, I probably have too much information for too little time, but I'll give it a shot. That's not the right spot. Let's see. Stop sharing.
You can hold it up in front of the camera.
I know, I am really sorry to the folks online who can't partake in the sugar overload.
Sorry, this is. Yeah, I'm working on it.
You're fine, Steve. More time for us to get cookies over here.
Okay. Okay, I'll try this again.
We could.
Maybe I won't. Let's see.
While Steve is working on things on his end, I do see we have a couple new folks online. I just wanted to thank you guys for being here. I see Allison from the tribe. You want to say hi, Allison?
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I was coming back from Boise, so I tuned in a little bit late, but
Oh,
it's
no
nice to
worries.
be here.
Oh, we're glad you're here. And then I see Melissa.
Hi, everyone. Melissa McKelvey from DFW. I'm in the Habitat Bio for the area. And yeah, just joining in. So thank you.
Yes, glad you're here, Melissa. And
Okay, I'm ready to give it another shot here.
all right, go ahead, Steve.
How's about this? You see that?
There we go.
Oh, yeah, Steve, looks beautiful.
Oh, great, great.
I
So
love the font.
The colors are really.
Thank you, Tyler.
You're welcome.
But it has all the important information on it.
Well, the title of this presentation is, oh, it's not working for me now. Was going to be water level monitoring. What is it and why do I care? Okay. Back in November, I put out this latest, greatest 2022 update of the daily hydrograph maps. Some of you have seen this. I don't know if all of you have, but some years will go by and I make this map and I don't know that anyone even sees it. So I thought, and Celine agreed, that it might be a good idea that I kind of go over what monitoring is all about and what we use the results for. So that's what this is about. Okay, back in the day, the way we used to measure water levels is we used what was called a steel tape. Amazingly, that's a steel tape measure on a reel. And it's like a dipstick, except it has markings for feet on it. And you would reel that down into the well until you got below the depth of the water. And then you'd pull it back up, kind of like a dipstick in a car, and you'd be able to see where the water level was. And you'd subtract that number from the number at the very top of the well, and you'd say, okay, the water is this far down. And if you were kind of an amateur, not a pro, you would get a piece of chalk like they used to have back in the day in school, and you would rub the tape at the bottom with chalk. And then when it got in the water, it would wash the chalk off. So it was a lot easier to tell where the water level was, just kind of like on a dipstick where it's kind of hard to tell where the oil is sometimes. So that's the way it used to be. And it was kind of a hassle, and you had to go out to the well and measure it every time you wanted to get a number. So in modern times, we've upgraded to this thing that's called an E-tape. And instead of it being a steel rigid tape, it's now a plastic tape. But if I zoom in on this tape, you can see there's these two bumpy things on the edge. And what those are is two wires. And so when you lower this thing into the well, and this point hits the water, it bridges the contact between the two wires, and there's a little buzzer up on top that beeps. So you just lower it down into the well until it beeps, and then you know that's what the water level is, and you read the reading off of the tape. So that's the modern version of the steel tape, which is used to get a single point water level measurement these days. Cool. That works pretty good too, but you got to go out to the well and put it down the well every time you want to measure it. So now in digital days, we have these things called level loggers, or sometimes called data loggers. And like Kyle said, those are about the size of a big Cuban cigar. And what those do is they can record the water level or the depth of water above the logger. And they can store that information. And then you can come out periodically, take those things out of the well, grab the data off them, and you get a bunch of measurements instead of just getting one measurement at a time. So if you want to get a measurement every day or every minute or every second, you can set these correctly to store the information at those intervals and then come back later and collect the information. So it makes it a lot easier to get really high quality data. So how do these level loggers work? Kyle talked a little bit about it. It's kind of like having a scale. And so the pressure transducer is effectively a scale. And what it's doing is it's weighing how much water is over the top of it. So if there's a bunch of water sitting over the top of the logger, that means the water level's high. And so the scale is going to read high. If there's not so much water, then the scale is going to read low. And so what it does is it reads how much pressure or how much weight is above it. And then it converts that into feet of water and stores that information so that when you download it, you'll know how many feet of water are sitting over the top of that data logger. Okay, so what's inside the guts of this? Hopefully Kyle was going to be able to cut one of those apart. I did that many years ago and it was a real challenge. So I'm kind of glad Kyle didn't try to do that because I almost lost a finger trying to do it.
Can you bring it to the meeting and we could do it together? Yeah. I'll bring an axe.
So what's inside one of these? Well, there's the pressure transducer. So that's the scale. That's down at the right-hand end here. You can kind of see in through here. It's right in there. And then there's a circuit board, of course, because it's digital and it records things. And on the circuit board, there's a clock and there's storage. So you can set the clock to go out and grab the number off of the scale and store it in the chip. And then when it's all powered well with a battery, and this is the reason that we worry about how long the data loggers have been in the well, because the battery will go dead after a while. There are loggers you can buy with replaceable batteries, and Ecology uses some of those. We, PBAC, decided not to do that because we didn't want to mess with being out in the field, in the cold, trying to change batteries out, and then wondering whether or not the battery put in was good and how long it was going to last. So we buy basically disposable loggers. And the batteries are getting pretty reliable to the point where they can last like 10 years when you record things at 1 hour increments. So that's kind of what's inside of one of these loggers.
And we do record at 1 hour increments, Steve?
Yeah, right now we do. When we do some kinds of research, they have to set them for really fine increments because we need a lot more data when we do things like pump testing. And sometimes they'll set them for 1 second intervals or 1 minute intervals. I'm not sure how long the new loggers or how many data points the new loggers will store. But, 10 years ago, they would store like 10,000 points and then it got to be 20,000 and now it's maybe 40 or 60,000. So as time goes on, they can store more information and we can leave the loggers in the well longer before we have to download.
Sure.
So what's the procedure? Kyle goes out to the wells, each one of the wells, and he pulls the logger out of the well. The logger's hanging down in the well off of this end right here, maybe off of a rope or a steel cable, or even in some cases, fishing line, strong fishing line.
How long does that take, Kyle? Pull it out.
It depends, but
A while?
some of them are deployed like 200-300 feet.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a shoulder exercise.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Steve.
That's okay. So you pull the logger out of the well, you unscrew the left-hand side, you can see where this seam is, that cap comes off, and then there's a special connector you can put on that connects it to the computer. You can download the data off the logger. Then at the same time, you've got your manual measurement, and that's the way you convert what the logger's telling you to what that really means in terms of elevation above sea level. So the water level meter will tell you how far you are below the surface, and the logger will tell you how much water's above the logger. And with those two numbers, you can come up with what the elevation above sea level the logger's at. And that way you can compare different wells using that sea level elevation as opposed to just what the logger's reading. And then you reset and you put the logger back into the well and you move on to the next well. So that's the procedure, in addition to all the little trivial details that Kyle is really well versed in that are involved in each one of the wells, like horses and wasps and sometimes gates and locks and all kinds of different things you have to maneuver to get all these data. Okay, this is kind of a side thing, but in order to figure out or to understand what's going on when you measure the water levels, you kind of have to understand how a pumping well works. And the analogy that I like to use is this one right here, where you think of the aquifer as like being a really thick milkshake. And then the pump that's down in your well is right up here. And so what the pump is doing is it's pulling water out of the aquifer or pulling milkshake out of that straw, out of the bottom of the milkshake. And for anybody, of course, everybody, I'm sure, has pulled on a good sturdy straw in a milkshake. And what you see is you see a dent where the straw is. It makes a dent. And eventually that dent will fill in. But as soon as you suck on the straw, you see a dent on the top of the aquifer. So when you go back to the well analogy of this, when you pull water out of the aquifer in the well, it basically makes a dent in the aquifer, and water that's close to that dent falls in to fill in that hole. And then the water that's close to the water that just fell in to fill the hole falls into that area. And as you work your way out, you're getting a bigger and bigger circle as you go around. So there's not as much depth of water needed to fill in the gap of the water inside of you. And you can see that it kind of tails off to when you get out past what's called the area of influence, you can't really even tell that that well is pumping. So on the Palouse, if you're maybe 20 miles away from one of the big wells in Pullman or Moscow or Palouse, you might not even realize that those wells are pumping. But if you're 100 feet away from one of those wells, the water level might go down almost instantly, 10, 15, 20 feet. So it depends on how close you are to the pumping well, what kind of water level response you get. And that's what some of the pumping tests do, is they listen to the aquifer, they monitor the water level in the aquifer. And if one pump turns on and at some point in time soon after you see the water level go down, that's an indication that both of those wells are hydrologically connected. And so that's kind of what pump testing is about. Okay, well, that works good for one well. What happens if you got two people sucking off the milkshake? Okay, each straw acts like a single well. And out at the edge of each of the straws, you can't really tell the difference. But when you're in between the straws, the wells actually interfere with each other. So you kind of get double the decline in the water level in between these two wells. So the net effect on the aquifer is you get these bumps. So where the wells are separated, you'll have bumps. And if a well turns on or turns off, these bumps come up and down and they kind of undulate. And that's what's going on with the surface of the aquifer when we're pumping the aquifer system. So what happens when you're on the Palouse and you've got a whole bunch of wells? You know, you've got a bunch of them in Pullman, and you got a bunch at WSU and UI and Moscow and City Palouse, and you've got a bunch in the upper aquifer that we monitor too. Well, it becomes really hard to take a one-time measurement of the aquifer and determine what that means. So you need a longer term record of what's going on with the water levels to get a better feel for what's going on in the aquifer. Okay, so this is the map that I used this year for the monitoring wells. And this map only has 29 of the 34 on it. Some of the aquifers or the wells are really close to each other, so it would be redundant to have both of them on the map. And every once in a while, one of the wells doesn't give us quality data, or we don't have a long enough term record for that data. But each one of these cross-haired circles has a number next to it. And the blue ones are the lower aquifer wells, and the red ones are upper aquifer wells. So you can find a well, this is an upper aquifer well number 29, and you can go up to this map key and you can find out what well that is. And each well is associated with a hydrograph for that well. And that's what the map looks like. So for each one of the 29 locations on the map, there's a hydrograph on this map where you can quickly go and see how the water levels have been behaving over the period of record that we've been recording. So when you look over the entire aquifer and you look at the blue wells, all the blue wells seem to kind of be similar. You see that kind of steady decline in the water levels. And those are the lower aquifer water levels. And one of the reasons we know that these wells are all connected to each other is they all behave kind of the same way. They all have that constant rate of decline, and it's basically the same rate of decline over time. So that helps us believe that those are all connected hydrologically. The red wells, they're kind of all across the board. You see some red wells that are pretty steady over time in terms of a trend. You see other wells that go down for a while and then they come back up. And then you see wells that you don't really know what's going on. And that's because the upper aquifer isn't really one aquifer. It's kind of a bunch of compartments that are separated in space, so that all upper aquifer wells don't behave the same. So I picked out a couple of the wells on this map to look at the hydrographs. In the lower aquifer, I picked this well, which is the DOE Pullman test well. And that's kind of halfway between Pullman and Moscow, right next to Motley and Motley off of Sunshine Road, down there in the banks of Paradise Creek. And if you drive by there and you see this big, tall, 6-foot-high standpipe sticking out of the ground, and you ever wondered what that was, that's this monitoring well. So we've been monitoring this well with Dataloggers since the late 90s, but we've had pretty good high-quality data since 2006. So for quite a while, we've had high-quality data. And what each one of these hydrographs have is they have 3 different curves on them. They have, since every day the logger records one reading every hour, we can't graph all the hours of data on one graph. So what I do is I average things out by the day, and I make a chart of the average reading for each day, another curve for the maximum reading each day, and one for the minimum reading. So that's what those 3 curves are. And you can see they're not the same, but they're close to each other in this well. But what is showing up here is what Kyle talked about, which is the atmospheric pressure effect, because the logger actually picks up the pressure of the air or the weight of the atmosphere above the logger. And so that's why the maximums and minimums are different, because during the course of the day, the pressure might change and the water level may go up or down as much as a half a foot, just based on the pressure of the atmosphere that's going over the top. Each one of the green triangles is a well visit where the E-tape went down. And like this case, Kyle went out there and visited. He put that tape down probably 300 feet, measured the water level. A year before that, he measured the water level. And you can see pretty consistently for the last several years, or quite a few years, we've only been going out once a year to get this stuff, because the logger's been storing up the information and then we pull it off once a year. Back when they were doing the pump testing, they had to go out a lot because they would fill up quickly because they were recording intervals of like 1 minute or 1 second. So that's why you'll see all these green triangles kind of bunched together when they were doing the aquifer tests. Now, in an individual year, what people like to do is they like to look at these and say, oh, well, it looks like we're discharging water here and we're recharging. So this must be recharge. This must be the discharge and this must be the recharge. Well, really, that's not so much the truth. What's actually happening, there might be recharge occurring throughout the year, but what's happening is this is where more straws start sucking harder on the milkshake. And so the cone that makes in the milkshake gets deeper, and the water levels that get measured then go down because they're measuring a cone that's getting deeper. And then once fewer wells are sucking on the milkshake, or they're not sucking quite as hard, that cone gets to relax, and that's called recovery. And that's what you see at the end of the pumping season. When the pumps kind of start to lay off, you can see the well starts to recover. Okay, but what happens when you're using the aquifer beyond its sustainable level is the well never recovers to the level that it was at the previous year. So effectively, you're taking water out of that aquifer that isn't being replaced by recharge. So when you see a water level hydrograph like this, what you can basically say is we're pumping out more than is being recharged. Right now, if you do the regression line from 2006 to this summer, you get about 0.7 of a foot a year. So that's how fast the water level's going down in the lower aquifer now, about 0.7 of a foot. And that's less than it used to go down. It used to go down at over a foot a year in the 1990s and early 2000s. But it's still continuing to go down, which means we're still continuing to pull more water out of the aquifer than it's being recharged. Okay, here's another lower aquifer well. This is in Palouse, the city of Palouse. And this one has wild looking yellow lines on it. And the Palouse well is in their city well, And so they have a pump in that well pulling on the water in the aquifer. So they have their own straw for the city inside of that well when we're monitoring it. So what these yellow lines are showing you is when they turn the pump on, the data logger recorded a value when the pump was on. And you can see that the water level was maybe 5, 6 feet lower when the pump was on than when the pump was off. And that's what's called the drawdown of the aquifer out there when you turn the pump on. So when you look at the hydrographs in this map and you see the hydrographs that have a bunch of yellow in them, you'll be able to say, oh, that well has a pump in it. It's not strictly a monitoring well, it's got a pump in it. So we're measuring not only the maximum level, which is that kind of cyan color, we're also measuring the minimum level in that well when the well's pumping. Okay, here's an upper aquifer well. This is at the old Moscow Police Department out on the sidewalk of the Moscow Police Department. So back in 2010, they were redoing the sidewalks in front of the police department, and they took the old side, ripped the old sidewalk off, and they discovered there was a well right underneath the sidewalk. And so it turns out there used to be a dairy there around the turn of the century, and the dairy used the well to water their cows, and progress came, sidewalks went over, dairies went away, but the well was still there. And so we put a logger in that well, and we've been monitoring it ever since. And you can see what's been going on in that well. This is kind of a crazy well, but this is measuring what's going on at the police department in the upper aquifer. So year to year, it would kind of go up and go down, but have a little bit of an overall decline year to year until 2007. And then something happened in 2007, and you see the upper aquifer starts to go like this. So not only is it recovering, it looks like it's past where it was before, so it must be recharging. So this upper aquifer by the police department must be recharging. That's what that hydrograph is telling us. And if you wonder why that might be, you can look at the pumping in the upper aquifer by the city of Moscow. And sure enough, from the years up to about 2017, Moscow pulled on average 30% of their water out of the upper aquifer. But starting in 2017 and especially in 2018, they curtailed the amount of pumping that they do out of the upper aquifer, and now they don't pump hardly any water out of the upper aquifer. So when they cut back on the pumping of the upper aquifer, then the recharge was able to overpower any other pumping in the upper aquifer, and the upper aquifer is recharging and going back to the levels that it used to be at before it was pumped. So that's how you see water level recharge in the aquifer.
Steve, as a side note, we'll get some really interesting data this next year. We've had well 6 down as we build a new pump house. And so we've been pumping the upper aquifer. And so it'll be really interesting to start to, our goal is to dial in and find that sustainable pumping level for that upper aquifer. And as we replace the filtration system, it is a lot higher in iron and manganese, but we should get some really good data in this next year on the impact of that increased pumping this year.
Yeah, okay, Kyle, that'll be good. One of the things you need to keep in mind is it's really great to have the upper aquifer recovering from that pumping. But what happens is when Moscow isn't pumping from the upper aquifer, they still need that amount of water. And so what they've done to compensate for not pumping out of the upper aquifer is they've been pumping out of the lower aquifer. So effectively, they're putting more pressure on the lower aquifer by curtailing the upper aquifer. And what we're shooting for is both aquifers to be sustainable. And that's part of what the Alternative Water Supply Project is about, is trying to come up with a supplemental supply that'll allow us to back off of our upper and lower aquifers and let them hit a sustainable level. So this saving water in one aquifer and using it in the other is this robbing Peter to pay Paul thing. So there isn't any free water that we know about in the aquifer that we can tap. At least a lot of water, let's say. Okay, so why do I care? You care because if you're a member of PBAC and you represent one of the entities, your entity agreed to abide by this wonderful thing called the Groundwater Management Plan that was enacted in September of 1992, where all the entities agreed to comply with what's inside the plan. And there's a bunch of stuff inside the plan, but I'm going to show you some of the things that apply to water levels. So chapter 6 of that plan is about the roles of the committee, what the committee is supposed to be doing. And 6.2 said it's the responsibility of the committee to collect water level information as well as consumption information. So they agreed that they were going to collect this information for water levels and consumption. So what you're doing with these loggers and daily hydrographs and things like that is you're meeting your commitment to the water management plan to collect the information. 6.2.3 is about research, and they have some bullets for what type of research they wanted to support. Model studies to evaluate the effects of these management strategies that you're looking at. Most all of the models that we use these days require water levels and pumping as inputs. So if we don't have data to put into these models, we won't ever be able to develop models that effectively allow us to evaluate the alternatives. So we have to collect the information to make the models worthwhile. Field investigations to better determine geologic, not only, but hydrogeologic characteristics. And the water levels help us determine the hydrogeologic characteristics, like those hydrographs I showed you. This one's recharging, this one's not being pumped sustainably. Those type of hydrogeologic characteristics we get out of the water levels. And then this one applies to the alternative supply study. Conduct studies of incremental water supply sources. Now, the word I like to use, which sometimes gets mixed up with incremental and alternative, is supplemental, because the plan is to find a water supply that supplements the groundwater, but to continue to pump the groundwater, but instead of pumping it unsustainably, to pump it sustainably, so that we'll always be able to have groundwater accessible, but we'll be pumping it sustainably. So that's a supplemental source, is what we're looking for. Okay, why do I care again? This is what we thought, or we said the basin boundary was in 2005, all the way up until last year. And there were always some questions and some arguments about places like Colfax. Well, is Colfax really part of the basin or isn't it? Is Palouse part of the basin or isn't it? And for years I've been asking Earl Bennett, having Earl Bennett ask if Genesee is in the basin or not. And so over the years, based upon our water level monitoring and the other geologic and hydrogeologic research, we've pretty much been able to conclude that Colfax is not inside the basin. The water levels there don't go down with that steady decline like they do inside the Palouse Basin. And the rocks are much lower there than they are in the Palouse Basin. So the same layer of basalt might be 250 feet lower in Colfax in elevation than it is inside the Palouse Basin. So we've concluded Colfax isn't in the basin. We used to not know about Palouse, but based upon geologic and hydrogeologic data for Palouse, we've concluded that Palouse is inside the basin. And why does it matter whether you're inside or outside? Well, it matters because if what happens in Pullman impacts what's going on in Palouse, Palouse maybe should be involved in the conversation. And vice versa. If what goes on in Palouse impacts what's going on in Pullman, maybe Pullman should know about it. And so identifying which communities are actually inside or outside the basin becomes kind of important. When I take the two lower aquifer hydrographs that I showed you before, the well outside of Motley and Motley on Sunshine Road, and the one that's in the city of Palouse, and I overlay them on each other, I see this. Okay, and you can see that they both behave really closely. Now, Palouse, there's a pump in that well, and so it pumps for their park and their swimming pool and their cemetery and all that. Palouse does behave a little bit differently than the Motley and Motley well. But over the long term, since we've been collecting this data, it's a pretty safe bet to assume that these are the same aquifer system. Because if Palouse and Motley were in different aquifers and we're pumping all this water out of Moscow and Pullman and only a little bit of water out of Palouse, we wouldn't see curves that look the same like this. So this is pretty strong evidence that they're in the same aquifer system. So the new boundary, which is now out and adopted by the committee last year, is a 2023 boundary. And you can see we've gotten rid of Colfax because they're not part of the basin. And we've included Palouse because we're pretty sure they're in the basin now. But we still don't know about Genesee. And back in, I think it was the November meeting last year, Dale Ralston came and he reported that Genesee had drilled a new well into the Grand Ronde. And so previously their wells had been in the upper aquifer, which is the Wanapum system. And that wouldn't have been connected to the lower aquifer system in the Palouse, but this new well we didn't know about. So I was able to go out to IDWR and get the well log from the IDWR database. And it reported that when they drilled the well in 2021, the depth to water out at the Genesee well was 490 feet. So best I can tell from 1,500 miles away, the elevation at that well is 2,730 feet above sea level. If I subtract that 490 feet depth to water at Genesee, I come up with a number of 2,240 feet, which is effectively the water level elevation at the Genesee well. And that is surprisingly similar to the water levels in the Moscow-Pullman Basin in the Grand Ronde lower aquifer wells. So it leads you to believe that there may be a chance that Genesee is also part of the Palouse Basin. We don't know that yet. And what we would need to do is collect geologic information from that well according to these rocks that they drilled and monitor the water levels over long periods. And if the geologic sandwich matches up Genesee to the Palouse wells, and the water level hydrograph matches up with whatever behavior is in one is in the other, then we might be able to conclude at some point that Genesee is connected to the basin too. So to that end, I'm recommending Genesee save the well chips from their well drilling. I'm recommending the PBAC fund having a geochemical analysis done of the Genesee well samples, so that we can see whether or not the basalt sandwich corresponds, lines up to the one in the Palouse. And I'm also recommending we put a data logger in there and start trying to record a long-term trend to see if it matches what's on the Palouse. So we can either say, no, Genesee isn't connected, or Genesee probably is connected in whatever number of years or research we need to get to that point. So that's my recommendation moving forward. And that's all I have. Any questions?
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, that's incredible, Steve.
So that gets us to our next agenda item, which is the Genesee well.
Before we move on, I do have one question for Steve, and that is, Steve, as you drill into the data and our data loggers, especially in the deep aquifer, and you see the water level rebound, it looks like during the months where we've got winter pumping, so we don't have irrigation demand. So that would imply that there's a level of sustainability at that pumping level. Would you agree with that?
I would, and I'll try to go back in my presentation and see if I can find the slide that the Palouse well is really the one that shows that best. Here I go trying to share my screen again. You can see on the Palouse well, it's kind of flat in the winter and the spring. And then when the pumping kicks in, it goes down. And when the pumping tails off, it gets up and it gets kind of flat again. And so the thinking there is during this period, basically October through April, the pumping is sustainable. And so we use about between 60 and 70% of the water during that time that we use over the course of the year. So if we could curtail our pumping by 30%, the thinking is we might reach a sustainable level. So in the Water Supply Alternatives Project, there's something called an aquifer stabilization supply that we're trying to get. And that stabilization supply effectively is getting an extra amount of water to cover that summer pumping, or about 30 to 35% of the total aquifer pumping that we make over the year. So that's what that flatness in the hydrograph is showing, is that it may be sustainable at that level.
So absent a good model, that gives us basically a fence line to say, okay, if we can reach this target, we know we can reach a sustainable aquifer.
Correct. And what will end up happening is if we reach that target, we'll want to continue to collect water level information and say, sure enough, it came back to the same level it was at last year. Or maybe it even got higher and we can say, oh, maybe we can pump a little more. Or maybe we would rather allow the aquifer to recover from that pumping, you know, and you can make decisions that way. But the water level monitoring is something that's going to need to continue to move on to both make the models better and to be able to tell if what you're doing is having the impact you want it to have.
So Steve, is Jeff taking that another level deeper? And this is probably more granularity than we have in the data, but as that aquifer decline has changed from over a foot a year to 0.7 or whatever the current number is, those seasonal oscillations, is it measurable, the difference in that? So what I'm getting at is, could the recharge rate have changed in conjunction with the rate of decline? Is that,
That's
you know,
right.
do we have the data to measure that?
I don't know that we do. I've thought about ways we might try to measure it. A couple of things that do happen is when the water level goes down, that tends to induce more recharge. So effectively a lower water level is like sucking harder on the straw. And so that it pulls harder on the water above it. But we're now thinking that we don't get that much direct percolation recharge, that a lot of our recharge is coming from the mountain front, and it doesn't have as big an impact there. But what does happen as the water level goes down, if there's water that's naturally discharging from the basin, the area that that water can discharge from can also go down. So you think of it as maybe a swimming pool that has a crack in it, and the crack is like a V-shaped crack. Well, as the water level goes down, there are those that argue the discharge will go down too, because you've got that smaller V that the water can move out of. And so there have been those discussions, but what ends up happening most years is the weather confounds things, because the difference one year to the next is driven more by what the weather is like one season to the next. We've never really been able to tease that level of detail out to say, definitely this is less discharge and more recharge or not. And we may never really know that based upon the quality of the data that we can get with this great unknown aquifer that's down below the surface.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Steve, Paul here. Great presentation. Remind me from our holiday pump test, when was that? 2009, 2010 maybe? We turned everybody off, right? And then we turned one well on at a time. So just high level, who did we turn on and where did we see that connectivity?
Well, there's several theses you can look at, graduate theses, that I'm not going to be able to give you the summary on in less than many years. But basically what we see is that Palouse, the city of Palouse, is far enough away from the pumping in Moscow and Pullman that it's really hard to tell when a well turns on or off in Moscow and Pullman when you're in Palouse. So that zone of influence that I showed in the early chart, it's probably somewhat less than the distance from Moscow Pullman to Palouse, but it's about that order of magnitude. But we do know that when you turn wells on and off in Moscow, the well halfway between Moscow and Pullman notices that. And when we turn wells on and off in Pullman, the well halfway between notices that. And so the halfway in between well notices pumping from both ends, and you combine that with the hydrographs and you're able to conclude that yes, both ends are connected. We just maybe aren't able to measure it with the detail and the granularity of the data that we can collect.
Is that why Palouse has that flatter curve in those winter months?
They're out at the edge of that cone, right?
Not being in.
Yeah, they're not close to that deep cone. And so they see a little bit of decline and then a return. And they also have their own pumps that are kind of pulling at them from real close that make it difficult to see what's going on. Okay. And it turns out in Moscow, this is kind of in the weeds, but Moscow wells 6 and 8 that Tyler was talking about, those are kind of on the east side of town. And then there's Moscow wells 9 and 10, which are on the west side of town. And when you turn on well 6 or 8, you don't see it in wells 9 or 10 and vice versa. So just within the city of Moscow, there seems to be a separation over the short term that keeps them from seeing each other. But over the long term, that water level hydrograph says, oh, geez, over the long term, they behave the same.
There's really really interesting fractures, even in the uprock for Steve, thinking about the connections with 2, 3, and then the police department well, the monitoring well, police department. It's really, we actually see 3, which is a little bit further. They're just right across the parking lot at our water building there on A and Main. So they're 40 yards apart. 3 is actually further from the police department well, but we see the impact more from the pumping of 3 in the police department well than we do the pumping of 2.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve.
Other
So I guess,
questions?
one more, I guess you should think of it not as a milkshake, but as one of my wife's favorite things, which is a blizzard. She used to like blizzards. It's not a nice uniform milkshake under.
Any questions online? Make sure we get that opportunity. Thank you tremendously, Steve.
You're welcome.
Steve's recommendation is of course the well chip samples and the data logger. Do we have any updates or thoughts on cost or implications
No.
around that yet?
I just want to make sure everyone in the committee knows that Genesee, did drill that well, and we were able to capture the chip samples. And we've been talking with Alta as well as John Bush to start to figure out what the cost would be to analyze those. So we're hoping to do that within the next month and bring that to the February meeting, if not the March meeting, and start analyzing those. And then, like Steve said, to get a data logger in there as well. But the other thought process is IDWR is probably not going to spend all this money for Genesee to drill this well without putting some sort of logger in that. So maybe we can just get the data from IDWR rather than PBAC funding that. So we just have to, Michelle, I might have to reach out to you soon, or your counterparts, and see if we can share that data once again.
Yeah, let's talk. I'm not sure what Daniel's plans are. I think he does want to monitor the water levels in that well, so let's have a conversation.
Yep, that's the plan.
Yeah.
So
I think Steve's presentation is compelling, but is there any discussion to not go down that path? I mean, or go down that path, I would.
Or to,
In terms of analyzing the chips, and
Or at least figuring out what our scope of work might be.
I think it's something we should pursue.
I agree, but I open it up to the group.
absolutely.
Yeah, I think we should task the technical subcommittee research to prep a scope of work for the geochemical analysis and then get a data logger in there.
Yeah, and with some coordination between who would do that for us and yeah.
Celine, if we need to go talk to Genesee.
Yeah,
Join.
I've had one conversation, but we'd like to have more conversations. I
Can I
don't
weigh
think,
in a little bit on this one?
yep, go for it, Steve.
Turns out, I'm not sure that IDWR actually paid for that well. I think the city paid. They may have gotten loans, but I'm thinking the city paid for that well. It's their municipal well. And the story I'm kind of hearing third hand is that they actually had to drill 2 wells because they had problems with the first well not being vertical, and maybe the drilling rig got hung up and things like that. But really we need somebody to go out there and check it out and talk to the Genesee folks that maintain their water system and see whether it's something really that's doable and that they would entertain doing and that they're willing to do before we kind of pounce on them and say, okay, PBAC's going to come in and do this to you people. And so it's both kind of a political thing and a technical thing. So if we could get somebody out there with a GPS to actually measure the elevation of the surface at the well and drop something down the well to make sure we can get a logger in that well, that would get us a little bit further towards deciding whether or not we want to pursue it all the way.
Did they grout back the one they failed with?
I don't know for sure what they did. That's one of the problems. If I were up there, I'd have probably gone out and just started bugging them, but I don't know.
That is my understanding.
I move that we fly Steve up here to go out and bug them.
I'll second that.
Come on, Steve.
Well, my wings would be tired and I wouldn't get there until August when the weather's nice, so.
You love winter on the Palouse, Steve. Come on.
All right. Well, we'll see if we can make some progress on that. These are good suggestions and things for us to follow through.
Yep. That'll be our spring work ahead of us.
Yes. Any other questions on the Genesee well chip samples?
I have just a quick sense. So I have a strong recommendation from John Bush as well. So I'm not gonna read it. It's, a whole page of reasons why this is important and it's worthwhile. So if you're curious or, interested and just want to know more about, what he's actually going to do with the data or what he's hoping that we can do with the data, just let me know.
And I think the technical subcommittee would be interested in looking at that, and may even come back in front of the greater committee.
CC,
Yeah.
I think I was CC. Thank you, Kyle.
I'd be
That's a good
curious
point.
what he had to say, but I think it's a good data point regardless.
Yeah.
And I think John Bush was involved with reading other chip samples, correct, Steve, in the past? Or you as well, I mean, maybe collaborated on that.
I'm not a chip guy, but John Bush is a chip guy and he's been doing it since the mid-70s, so he's seen a lot of chips. And, by the way, the guy sitting in that room, Kyle, is good at things like that too. And he's also, it sounds like, kind of excited about getting involved in the project. So we've got a person sitting in this room that would be the perfect person to grab this project and move it forward if the committee decides that's what they want to do. And Genesee's okay with it.
Kyle, I've never been called the perfect person in my whole life, so congratulations. At a very young age. At a very young age.
Well, thanks.
That's a compliment. All right. Let's move on to our next item. Oh, Chris. Oh, never mind. That was just your mouse. I thought that was we're going to move on to the next item, which is an update about the Alta extension contract. I'm gonna pass it over to Celine.
Yeah, so let me share this real quick. Just wanted to give the committee an update on Alta's extension. So if you remember, in July, the committee adopted, or I guess in August, adopted the alternative water supply project report. And after that, we extended Alta's contract for $50,000 for additional outreach and refinement. And the contract included, developing an executive summary for that report, conducting public presentations, participating in SEG meetings with entities, state agencies, the tribe, presenting at this water summit, participating in the leadership roundtable. So most of those things have happened since August. We've had a steady line of things going on. And then just last week, actually, we had our first agency meeting with Washington Fish and Wildlife, just to kind of say hello again, because we've had these agency meetings, but it's been with all 5 alternatives. And so I think having those meetings again to say, here's the one alternative that we want to move forward with is not a terrible thing to do. So as of January, the total bill was $20,000 and remaining is about $29,000. And so before we continue to spend that, because that would be we could spend that in a heartbeat. Just wanted to make sure and pause for a second, make sure we're going down the right path for next steps. So a couple different options. We could just stop the work with Alta and continue on internally. We could continue to discover next steps with the different state agencies, fisheries, wildlife, DOE, IDWR, things like that.
More specific to alternative 5.
Yes, specific to alternative 5. Alta could also help us craft a future RFP and help us define those rough cost estimates for that RFP.
Just so we know what we might be getting into.
Because we know that there's probably some more data that we need for alternative 5. But that could also be water rights exploration or just a new RFP just to talk to the state agencies. Or we could do a hybrid of all of these things. That $29,000 is going to go pretty quick with 2 or 3 people in the room with each meeting. anyways, we had a conversation last week, Kara, Tyler, Sean, Paul, just, we thought discussing it with committee at large would be a good thing, just to make sure we're on the right track. So I'll open the floor if you guys want to add anything else. Kara, Tyler, or Sean?
Yeah, I thought you summarized it pretty well. We just want to make sure that everyone's kind of on board with the direction that we're headed. Obviously, we have gaps and things to fill, but we want to make sure we're using that remaining 30,000 responsibly. I will say, like, the first bullet, stop work and continue on internally. My personal opinion is there is some value to continuing at least some portion of work, just because it's good, it's good for saline. Like the Washington Fisheries meeting, we had Robin was there, and then she also brought in someone from Jacobs, who's really very familiar with fisheries and some of those things where we maybe have a few, maybe that's not our technical area of expertise. So I hesitate, this is my personal opinion, to stop on the first bullet item, but we also want to open it up to the group and see, make sure there's not concerns or ideas or other thoughts from the greater committee. The way I put that. It's quiet. I hear crickets.
Maybe it's sugar crash right now instead of the sugar.
I know. I know. I didn't anticipate that.
Yeah, I don't know. As I think about this, I think that it's a little bit of we're at a crossroads here where trying to make sure that we spend the money wisely and put it towards stuff that actually is helpful. I guess I think I agree, Kara, that there are aspects of things that we can continue to do that I think would be good to have the targeted help with. And so to, I guess, do those things that really make sense, some of the outreach to some of the oversight organizations that still needs to happen. But then future work, really trying to define and refine what it is that what are the most important steps, and what's the best way for us to use those resources toward pushing forward an alternative.
I know when we were without an executive director for a little bit, we were relying pretty heavily on Alta to be reaching out and doing a lot of those. So like a hybrid approach, we could step back and Saline could maybe coordinate some of the meetings directly, but we still pull Jacobs or Alta in for, I don't know, that won't save us tons, but it might save us a little bit as we navigate.
I guess that's kind of how I would envision it is, internally we generate what we think are those important next steps, and then Saline can identify where that support would be helpful and bring that back and say, hey, I think this is a good spot to plug in those resources. Does that seem like a doable thing for you, Saline? Is that something you feel like you have enough context to be able to tackle something like that?
I think for me, it's just knowing the right people to contact for the different state agencies. And then, the fisheries meeting last week, they speak a different language, so it would be really helpful. But I mean, Sean, you brought up a unique idea last week of just maybe we shouldn't be having these one-off agency meetings and just stopping our work with Alta right now and pulling together an RFP for a different direction just for water rights exploration.
Yeah, I think that's the critical path item at this point is really the water rights. And so whatever we can do to advance that piece, that'll give us basically the next answer for the next step. So in my mind, that's going to be the most bang for the buck.
I guess that's my concern is I think that at this point, our continued conversations, while they're going to be critical with some of these oversight agencies, what we're going to get a lot of is, well, if, and ultimately we're just going to have having to resubmit whatever we resubmit anyway. And so,
and to be clear, we're not submitting any official application. It's just starting to make relationships with the agency saying, this is what we want to do. How does this make you feel? And which is always good to do relationship wise, but it's not giving us any deliverables. And I think that's the conversation that I want to have today is what do we want Alta to deliver on the remaining $29,000? If anything, because we can continue to have those exploration meetings, but we might not get anything tangible from them. Other than relationship building. Which is not bad, but.
Well, I think we have water rights experts from both Washington and Idaho under the Alta contract, but as sub-consultants, right? And so that might be a place where we could move that work through the Alta contract, or the alternative would be to contract directly with, those experts. But since we've already got Alta under contract, then that saves you the step of going through the RFP. There's probably a 5% sub-consultant bump that Alta charges, but that's not huge. Grand scheme.
Yeah, well, and maybe it's reaching out to them and asking them to define what our next steps would be.
Like, what do they suggest
for that water rights exploration? I mean, I do feel a little bit like at least the Washington Fish and Wildlife meeting. I mean, there's discussion about low flows and what they feel is comfortable, and lots of numbers and foreign languages thrown around in there a little bit as well. But a little bit hand in hand. I mean, we have to know a little bit what we're going to ask for when we go for water rights, So I guess I feel like they go in hand a little bit, but how do we capitalize, the funds that we have right now to get to kind of the priority information, right? Without taking it too far. So the basics, but.
I think we also need to be mindful of the funding opportunities appear to be more realistic on the Idaho side. And so tomorrow, Water Resource Board meets. One of the agenda items is their priority list of water projects, which Saline, as you all know, submitted an updated request. So I think, Saline, are you going to be on there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be on it too. So that'll give us a better sense. I was in Boise Monday, Tuesday with a number of Water Resource Board members and Brian Patton, as well as Matt Weaver from the agency. And yeah, again, I think they're expecting more from us, more concrete, like, here's what we want to do, and they'll get some funding in front of us. So with that sort of mindset, I think, yeah, the water rights, absolutely, but also if as a step one, maybe let's focus on an Idaho project, maybe, or keep moving forward the alternative modified 5 or whatever we're calling it today. But mindful that the opportunity is more likely to be successful on the Idaho side right now.
So maybe based on what you said there and the item up here, I mean, maybe a good way to look at it as a short-term goal is to define what, I mean, I think you said there might be funding. So what does our RFP look like for what potentially we would want to do? Do you see? Yeah.
Yeah, from a technical concern, I'm not a civil engineer, and I'm sure there's at least a couple of them in that room right now, but I would be concerned about the treatability concerns of that alternative and really what it's going to take to treat that water. And if you need 10-acre settling ponds where you divert your water and you do the economics of that part of the O&M costs, you might say, boy, this alternative is really a loser now. We need to look at something that's not going to involve that, because we're not going to be able to treat the water even if they let us have it. And I may be way off base, but I would think that there's somebody out there that would be able to tell you whether you can treat it and how expensive it would be to treat it based upon the turbidity. And if we need to get turbidity data, that's one of those data refinement things you could do. But if not, one of the consultants maybe has someone that's a treatment expert who would be able to just tell you right away, yeah, it's doable, not a problem, or it's a big problem.
Yeah, and I think this is where maybe I'm struggling, is that we've got chicken and egg. Like, do we focus on water treatment? Do we focus on siting a treatment plant? Do we focus on aquatic life and quality and quantity, or do we focus on water rights? Also can help us with all of it or just one of it.
Well, I feel like in thinking about all of those things, the things that will matter before a lot of other things matter is going to be water rights and treatability, because like if we can't get the rights and we can't treat it, it doesn't matter what impact it has on aquatic life. It doesn't matter where we site a treatment facility. None of that stuff even matters if there's not the volume there, and if the volume is there, but we can't treat it, it doesn't matter.
So maybe an RFP defines a scope of work that somebody would need to do to answer some of those questions as kind of a pre-design.
I think so.
Do we have any feel for, I mean, obviously, it sounds like we have more funding opportunity in Idaho presently, but if we pull from Paradise Creek, I guess it's in Idaho at that point, so they have the only say, but that does impact down. I mean, does Washington get pulled into that, and do we have any leverage in that?
I think Washington would be part of the conversation for sure, but Idaho is a consumptive use state,
so it doesn't.
So.
Okay. Other discussion on this? I'm kind of hearing proceed a little bit with some of the funding that we have, but strategically.
So maybe
with the goal to really define what our next ask would be from a consultant.
So maybe, and I'd be willing to help with some sort of draft scope of work.
Yeah, maybe we need to ask Alta for scope of work for water rights and water treatment.
Yeah.
RFP process in order to go out for the big fish.
Kind of talk to people, the experts necessary to get an appropriate scope for those two items, I think would be a good next
And
step.
I've told Sailing this, sometimes with RFPs, you can leave them kind of vague and let the consultants tell you what you need. So you can play that game a little bit, but I also think it will be important for us to have a feel for big picture scope of kind of what kind of ask that is, right? So that we're not going out with an RFP that then we don't feel like we can actually award to somebody. So getting Alta's input, even maybe not a detailed cost, because that would be something you would ask all the consultants or whoever you select, I guess the most qualified consultant to provide that, and you would negotiate that later. But we want to make sure that we have funding,
I would hope that Alta could give us a roundabout number, so then when we do go out for
planning
RFP.
We're doing it responsibly
Yeah.
with the intent that we could follow through.
And we'll go over the budget stuff in a minute, but we have about $256,000 in the research budget. My guess is an RFP for scope of work for water rights and treatment. We'll eat that up in about 2 seconds. So,
Well, let's see how tomorrow goes too.
Yeah.
That helps.
Yes.
And I think there will continue, once we have an idea of what it is that we want to do next, there's probably other grant opportunities also.
Yeah.
So, we should use what's maybe the most likely to succeed.
I think what behooves us is to get together the best plan that we can get together, and then we'll look at what that plan costs. And I think that there will be funding opportunities, but.
Then we'll be able to provide neat and narrative and reasoning and justification.
Then we can lay out a good plan for what those needs are and better articulate that.
So I might, in the coming months, rely on the technical subcommittee to help with Alta's work, getting this step.
I think we should do that.
Okay. All right. Any other comments, concerns, feedback?
Okay, subcommittee reports. I'm gonna open it back to Sammy.
Yep.
Budget.
Make sure my screen. So just quickly, the admin budget, we have about $166,000 there, and the research budget, $256,000. We've got our next budget subcommittee meeting on February 7th to talk further about those.
Is that the budget or is that what's in the bank account?
That's in the bank account, sorry.
Yeah, that's the balance. It's the
balance. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
It didn't seem like a budget number. 80,
Yeah.
we're gonna not spend a penny more than 38 cents.
That's a great.
Okay.
So we've got a few updates from U of I, so I want to walk through this. We had what I called our roadshow in September, just explaining or presenting to the agents, the different entities about our alternative water report. And we did that with U of I, and when we met them, we met with VPs of research, as well as the sustainability director. And after that conversation, President Green said, let's continue our contributions and promise the payback for the research contributions from U of I.
And U of I, we haven't had contributions
Since
in the research.
part since FY20. Since then, we've received an email a couple weeks ago from VPs of research and finance that had a meeting with President Green that said U of I won't continue research payments unless PBAC provides a research plan. If there's no research plan, that's fine, but then PBAC needs to provide an implementation plan and would need to include a spend down plan for how they intend to, quote, use the hundreds of thousands of dollars that they have accumulated in the research fund. And so if a plan isn't provided to U of I, all support will be eliminated in FY24, which starts in July of this year. And that means they would withdraw from the committee, the contributions, and PBAC would need to find a different host entity. So my priority right now is to come up with an implementation plan. And how I'm looking at this is I think we need to bring back the annual report, which hasn't been done for a couple of years, because as much as I want to appease U of I to continue our work as a committee, really all the entities should be able to have this plan in front of them. So if we just bring back the annual report, it helps us provide information for all of our entities. It helps us provide information at the water summit, things like that. Or even state agencies when we have meetings with legislation and stuff like that. So, and then I think it's, an implementation plan, PBAC is pivoting a little bit from more applied or technical research, I suppose, or theoretical research to more applied research as far as the water alternative project goes. So what we talked about just now about how do we want to move forward with Alta, how do we want to move forward with water rights or water treatment? I mean, we do need to have that 2 5-year, 10-year long-term vision and figure out those bite-sized pieces from year to year. So that's my update. Happy to hear feedback because this has been my month and a half.
I have some questions, Selena. I don't know if they're best. It might be Rusty. Did we get a sense? I guess what I would like to do is make sure that whatever we put together is going to meet the expectations of the University of Idaho. And from that, I know that there have been concerns, and I would be interested I wouldn't want to put a lot of our time that could be going to something else toward putting something together and then just deliver it and have it be like, well, this isn't what we want.
Sure.
This isn't what we had in mind. Do we have clarity on what that looks like? Is there more specificity? Because I guess I just want to make sure that we're clear on what that expectation is on their part. If it's just fundamental questions about the value of PBAC in general, I'd rather know that up front and not jump through a lot of hoops. If it's just some structural concerns about how reporting's done and what the plan is for moving an alternative forward, so there is a fundamental desire to continue to work collectively toward solving the water issue in our basin, and it's just a structural concern, or are there just fundamental concerns and the U of I feels like going it alone is a better route for them? Does that make sense? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
No, I don't think ever, my sense is that they want to go it alone. I think what is one today is in your war chest there, you have $236,000 and they want to know from a continuation moving here, how is that money going to be spent down as we contribute towards an ongoing technical research or applied research or what have you. So I think this may be in phases of here's our plan for spending down funds based around research. And there may be a couple of drafts of that. Or, Saline could also reach out to Vice President Boise and Vice President Chris Namora and ask, okay, we want to implement a plan and what is our is there specific criteria and what things that need to be, what boxes need to be checked in doing that. So I think ultimately this wasn't Vice President Boise or Vice President Chris Namora. This was President Green's way forward and wanting to understand how the monies in the research coffers will be allocated or spent.
Gotcha.
Can I ask, what has this money been spent for in the past? Like for the model that was developed at WSU?
Caroline, Tyler, Paul.
Yeah, all kinds of research, for monitoring, the well monitoring for
Jeff Langman.
for the
worked with
model, the
seismometer.
seismometer work that Jeff Langman recently finished.
Okay.
That looked at the recharge along the Moscow Mountain front. So just research that has been associated with the aquifer and then with the alternatives. So we funded like some USGS monitoring to look at turbidity in the North Fork of the Palouse. And so we looked at suspended solids turbidity, all of that. So there's been just, a variety of research that's been.
And there's been a significant spend down in that amount. I mean, I think
Recently.
when UI Research pulled their funding initially in 2019 or FY20 it was close to $500,000 in that. And so it was a continuation of university going through budget crunches, if you will, and wanting to have more I'm on both sides of the fence of this because I'm like, the thing doesn't say we have to provide a plan, but I've lost that battle. And this is the way forward, the path to continuation and doing that. And we could get a new administration and the path to change again. And so I think that's where the fluidness will come from. But so
And maybe the way to think about it is an opportunity to communicate, reconcile maybe lost communication and make that clear.
well, in their eyes, and I don't know about this from the city's perspectives or WSU, is where's the budget accountability? And I think we're trying to establish is there actually are folks paying attention to the budget and being accountable for a long-term sustainability of PBAC and the resources. And so I think that's ultimately the crux is accountability. And
Yeah, and I think that like establishing like a routine way that communication happens that meets the needs of the various members of the committee is important. Up to this point, that check has been the representation that each entity sends to the committee.
I've got to do better at that myself. Is reporting out that kind of information. If someone Salem needs me to do that, and she's very capable of doing that herself too. I mean, I'm just here as giving her the information she needs or being the conduit she needs to the UI administration.
Yeah, but well, spending down the current balance is, in my mind, second to having a long-term plan of what we're trying to accomplish. It seems like we could spend millions on research and all sorts of things. It's more matching what's an appropriate amount of money to keep in that fund for the ebb and flow of the research activities and identifying where we headed and what's that going to cost and what are we going to prioritize. And maybe some historical data about what has happened with that fund over time might be of use in that conversation.
Point out as somebody who's new here, it seems to me the research that has been done, like through Jeff Langman and the monitoring, even the model that is sort of failed, but has provided some information, has it sort of been fundamental to understanding where to go in the future. So it might be worth pointing that out, that your money has been well spent already.
And I think along those lines, some of the reason we are seeing a balance there that's higher than maybe it should be is that we're at a little bit of a crossroads as far as where to direct our efforts. And until we define where to go next, I think our research expenditures have lagged
Actually, those are words that Vice President Lamura has used. And it is, where are you going now? What is the next thing we're supporting?
So maybe it's even less on what's been in the past, but this is where we're going. And we already have been calling our research subcommittee the technical subcommittee today, but just stepping back for a second for folks who maybe do not know it right now, the 4 major entities, the 2 universities and the cities contribute to the research fund, 20,000 a year, or at least, actually, I don't remember what year that was established.
It was established in 2008, I believe.
Okay. And then
the research part, and it's increased.
The research component. We've also had some kind of internal talks about, as we look at, I mean, it may not be the short-term thing. Our bylaws and our inter-entity agreement, it might be advantageous to just lay out one pot. Like we have, a part-time staff, we have a full-time staff. These are the costs that it takes. This is what they're doing. This is why it's important. Here's what we want to do, and maybe less muddy the water.
I guess some of the conversations we've been having, is just that we've got an evolved system right now that evolved because there was a need with the groundwater management plan and the establishment of that in order to fend off getting declared a critical groundwater management area. The establishment of that plan required that cooperation. And so then the interagency agreement comes into place that lays out the groundwork for that cooperation. And then as work progressed, as Steve pointed out, some of the requirements in the groundwater management plan required research activities to happen. And so then the entity started to fund research. And so the 4 major funding entities fund research. And so it came on as this bifurcated thing where we had PBAC admin, PBAC research. But now as we're getting to a point where Paul talked about a little bit earlier, there's starting to be some significant funding. Once we start talking about the size and scope of this, there's going to be state level funding. There's money in the IIJA. There could be grant money that comes in through WIFIA or another similar program. That the PBAC funding needs are needs to fund really targeted things that technically didn't kind of fall. They fell in this kind of gray area with how we're defining research that may be more advantageous and easier to just say, these are just the PBAC dues. This is what we're all going to pay into PBAC. And rather than trying to parse out, this is this is that, and we can have just the money that we steer internally through the budget committee process. Here's what we're going to put toward technical stuff. And because everything else just goes toward salaries and printed copies and everything else.
I mean, there is in one of the bullet points, I think you called that out, Salem, is there's like 3 pathways. If there's no research plan, then there's a need for an implementation plan. If there's no implementation plan, they're okay with also just a spin down plan. And so I think 3 pathways for just showing there's fiscal accountability on the money, how it's being addressed.
And the thing that I appreciate about that too is just direction too. Where are we going and what's happening there? And I think that's something that all the entities will be happy to see.
Yeah, I think an implementation plan is going to be really, really necessary. I'm getting really bad vibes from Pullman. And yeah.
You're right.
No.
They throw that out every once in a while.
Yeah.
They go through
This is my first brush with it. So an implementation plan or annual report or something really focusing on the future is there are some fiscal conservatives that are going to say, where's the money going and what are we doing with it and why is this important? Because there's a lot of people in positions of making these kind of decisions that all they know about water is that it is wet. And
sometimes it fills up the downtown.
And sometimes
it goes into
the downtown.
It goes into all those. It goes into
too.
all the stores.
Yeah. That's the feedback. So yeah, we need to have something.
No,
Yeah.
Pullman's.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because like Tyler said, we're looking at some scary stuff here. Yeah.
I think the reason why we have technical or research and admin is so that we can ask some entities to give more money, and we break it up into 2 things so that we're not asking everybody for $60,000, we're asking for 20 and 40 or whatever the numbers are. And so, but Latah County is still coming in a really low number, relatively speaking. And so if we're just gonna have the dues be the dues and they all go in and then we work it out internally, like Tyler's suggesting, which makes a lot of sense, then we're gonna have to come up with some other way to charge different entities different.
Sure. And I think that defining that becomes relatively easy just because we have the major pumpers, which are the 2 universities in the city.
Yeah.
And none of the other entities, with the exception that where it gets a little bit interesting is certainly
Genesee
Palouse, and maybe if Genesee ends up being part of it because they're far smaller entities, obviously far smaller pumping levels. And so that's something that I think the budget committee would have to take a look at and figure out a fair disbursement, which I don't think that'll be terribly difficult to figure that out.
Just need to work
A quick question just for you on this, because I like the idea of where you're at, which is like almost the dues portion. Is that going to mess you up at all when asking for grants that you don't have specific things pulled down in your budget? That it's an all these entities are giving to, for lack of a better term right now, the pot, rather than this much to research and this much to technical. Will that
I think it's
hurt you
just
at all?
the way you explain it, because PBAC can still have a yearly budget that says we spend,
We can commit a level.
yeah, 60% here, we spend 30% there.
I just didn't want that to be a surprise. If
Yeah.
also we decided to do that one, I don't know.
But how you have always taken it is that the research dollars comes from research and the
Sure.
admin ops dollars comes from finance. And they're seeing it bifurcated like that, whereas the other entities just say, here's the money for all of it. So I think it just helps us, maybe PBAC step back and say, it should just, it's all going to the.
Yeah.
We have had discussions. I mean, when we voted on what were research activities, it was the 4 major entities that voted on those. But we are getting to a point where there are some areas where it's like, is that admin? Is that research? It's.
As we get, and as we get more into the implementation, I think we'll have more of that, where it's like there are activities that need to happen that are kind of in that gray area where it's like, is that public outreach? Like, is that research, is water rights,
Well,
is water rights
the
exploration
Datalogger.
research, is it?
Would you call that research or we call that admin?
And we've
That's
been
something that
admin.
we
Yeah.
have to do.
Right.
But, if the admin budget's dropping, it's still technically could be considered research because that's part of the research charge. So that's the kind of.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I think inevitably, when a plan is put in place, what U of I would like to see is the entities come together and the financial responsible folks from the entities, and if it's revising the existing plan, because what U of I would like to inevitably do is move this to a centrally funded obligation and not a research and not an administrator. And that's Vice President Boise's approach after we reconcile and make PBAC whole. And so in the last bullet was, we owe them this amount and we could handle that from central once we have X in place. And so that's the goal moving forward, is this becomes a committed obligation, which will be subject to future budget reductions and everything else as it relates to that. So because PBAC would fall under the Division of Finance and Administration, like as far as centrally funded.
Yeah, that makes sense, Rusty. Yeah.
So know that that's the end pathway or the end goal of that path.
So obviously priority, my priority for the next few months. I mean, it sounds like I will follow up and just ask for some criteria, deadlines and whatnot. And maybe if we need to have a larger conversation.
One other thing, just getting some drafts put together that we can bounce off all of the entities and make sure that everybody's comfortable with the way it's coming together.
Yeah, and that may include prioritizing goals. Steve gave a great presentation today about the importance of continuing our data monitoring. So, that's just one example of something we need to carry along, budget for, and, provide the context and reason as to why to maintain and keep doing that. That's just one example.
And I think, Sean, we're probably overdue in meeting as the research and technical committee anyway, and maybe we could
Yeah,
dovetail that into discussion.
yeah, we can. We're in a new year. We're gonna amp back up.
New Year's resolution, guys. Coming at you. So that's budget update.
Yeah.
Dry January, wet, working hard on.
Fluid February.
Yeah,
Not either.
trying to go with the water, dry, wet thing.
Yeah. Paul, communications.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Communications wise, that we are working with Fuse as directed and approved by the committee on some visuals. And so we got a first draft. We made some edits and it's back in their hands. So thank you, Celine, for continuing that forward. I thought it was kind of fun to see some visuals.
Nice to
Some of
get
the-
something.
more of a layman's terminology.
Yeah.
Translation. So
I'm hoping the next draft I'll send out to the communication.
Yeah, just a more
subcommittee.
accessible nomenclature for the thing, and yeah, it was good to see.
And then scheduling outreach soon, but again, we want to be mindful, respectful. We are a one-person entity and we need to use saline as
I got some homework.
much as possible. And yeah, I mean, just given the priorities today, like, yeah, we'll get out with outreach.
You have something?
I just had a question about the 50K that Latah County is putting forward for the alternative.
For the
conservation water devices and so forth. Did we want to use any of that for having AmeriCorps members help with staff? If so, we should probably contact them soon. That might also help you with
I think,
assigning tasks.
yeah, I've met with your PCI.
Yeah, with Courtney.
Yeah, Courtney. Sorry, I couldn't remember her
Okay,
name.
no, that's
But
good. But if you
with-
did,
Yeah, with the way AmeriCorps sets up their schedule, I think at this point we need to focus on a July, August person coming on in July and August because they're already through their year halfway and the deadline's missed. So,
well, and that can change.
yeah,
You can
yeah,
you can do fewer numbers of people or more people with fewer amount
yeah.
of time.
But once we
So you-
actually receive the money, I think that's when I'll actually focus on the
Make it happen.
application to get some more help.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, don't we?
Yeah.
But yes,
Leverage AmeriCorps.
Something to work.
This is
Okay.
good
Doesn't
stuff
fall
for
the
them.
same.
That'd be really good. Yeah, because I'm just thinking about ceilings time.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
We don't really have a research
no,
subcommittee update.
other than we'll schedule a meeting soon.
And yes, do we, guess we didn't have this on here. Maybe next time we can regroup on our subcommittee assignments.
Oh, that would be good.
Yeah.
The only other thing I want to add, Tyler, just stepping out, I know we talked a lot about kind of our next steps with Alta and what we want to do with alternative 5. There's that other aspect, conservation. I know Ullman and Moscow were still working pretty rapidly to look at implementing, at least Ullman will have new and Moscow changed as well, some irrigation restrictions around that. So that is making progress as well.
Yeah, that's exciting.
So it's not, the things aren't, that we've kind of focused the attention on the technical aspects of the larger capital projects associated with that, but outreach and conservation and efforts continue. Yeah.
Next is other reports and announcements.
We actually used up most of our
I know.
time. I'm impressed.
Sean, I think you have an announcement.
Fair enough. So I just want to give the group a heads up. I submitted my resignation with Pullman, so.
You heard about Pullman's problems.
He's gonna go to Lewiston,
Be able to come out.
Yeah.
We're all the rest, John.
The record, PBAC doesn't have to accept it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
It's not a bad,
I'll use the Steve strategy and tell the commute in.
Yes, we're gonna miss Sean and
This one.
wish him best though.
Thank
So
you.
that will leave us with a vacancy for Pullman,
Yes.
so we'll have to talk through that and the research.
You get Eileen and I fairly regularly, so we'll probably, we'll strategize, but I would think we'll probably try and tune in the new public works director into his position. But I don't think, I think Eileen and I will be able to represent at least in the short term.
And as a research subcommittee chair.
Yes, we can figure that.
Yep.
We are on it.
Our next research meeting.
Yes,
Or
we are.
sorry,
Technical committee meeting. Questions, comments, reports from anyone in this room or online? Thank you to everybody for spending almost 2 hours with us today. We do need to have a motion to adjourn. That's what we all want to do.
Motion to adjourn.
Okay. All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? None want to stick around? Great, we'll see y'all next month.